Okay, let us begin. Good afternoon and welcome to the Human Rights Initiative panel. I'm happy St. Patrick's Day. My name is Kyotaro Tsutsui. I'm a faculty member in the Sociology Department and director of the Human Rights Initiative here. And today we're delighted to welcome two esteemed human rights advocates to Ann Arbor. And such a distinguished panel became possible thanks to the Donia Human Rights Initiative Fund and support from the International Institute. And we'd also like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Program in International and Comparative Studies, the International Policy Center at Ford School, and the Center for the Education of Women, all at the University of Michigan. Our speakers today need a little introduction, especially to those of you who are interested in human rights issues. But the main focus of today's panel, the Security Council Resolution 1325, probably requires a little bit of annotation. How many of you have heard of Resolution 1325? Okay, a few of them. Yeah. I actually, before beginning to work on putting together this panel, I really had little knowledge of that resolution, and I'm supposed to be a human rights expert. So don't feel bad if you hadn't heard about it, and you're here to learn about that. Yeah. And our two speakers will elaborate on the details of what it is and what it aspires to do, and what this report that they are writing right now is about. But I wanted to quickly set the scene so that you have some background knowledge of the Resolution 1325. The Security Council Resolution 1325 was adopted in 2000 by the United Nations Security Council and is seen as a landmark framework that for the first time made the connection between peace processes and gender equality. And the primary motivation for this lay in the changing nature of warfare in the post-World War II world. The nature of wars shifted from trained soldiers as the main combatants to more of intrastate civil wars, okay, where that produced massive numbers of civilian casualties, an increasing proportion of whom are women. Okay. And the rise of violence against women in conflict and also post-conflict situations has been reasonably well recognized, but and yet only small percentage of those involved in the peace process, negotiators and mediators and signatories, are women. And there's by now very strong evidence indicating that getting more women involved in peace processes or peacekeeping missions actually changes the political dynamic and facilitate building of sustainable peace. And in recognition of all these facts, the Resolution 1325 calls on member states to make efforts to protect women from gender-based violence during conflict, and also to take into account the particular needs of women in conflict situations, where conflict situations and refugee camps and in post-conflict recovery efforts, where women face a different set of challenges and vulnerabilities that men are often inattentive to or unaware of. Okay? And the resolution also calls for greater participation of women in all levels of decision-making regarding the resolution, prevention, management, and resolution of conflicts. This resolution, 1325, adopted in 2000, was followed subsequently by 4 additional Security Council resolutions that further pushed forward the agenda set forth by the 1325. And the Security Council has also called on member states to adopt and develop the national action plans in 24 countries by now. 48? Yeah. Have done so. That's double what I know. Okay. U.S. has announced its intentions to make that happen in 2010, and it has in. And this year, the UN Security Council is in the process of re-evaluating the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and to close the gap between the promise of the resolution, 1325, and its actual implementation. 10 Nobel Peace Prize Laureates, including Ms. Jody Williams, commissioned Jared Genser here, and other participants to author and prepare and submit a report to the UN Security Council and evaluating the impact of the resolution and recommending how its implementation can be improved. So that's the report they are working on, and that's what they're going to talk about. And let me briefly also introduce our two speakers. They need a little introduction, but the first panelist today, the first speaker today is Ms. Jody Williams. She, as you all know, is the recipient of Nobel Peace Prize in 1997 for her work to ban landmines, working as the founding coordinator of the international campaign to ban landmines. It's a coalition of civil society organizations, and she led the charge in establishing the mine ban treaty, known as Ottawa Convention. And she continues to be engaged in these issues around landmines, but more broadly, she's an activist advocating for peace and social justice. And she, in 2006, she co-founded Nobel Women's Initiative to support and amplify the efforts of women working on around the world, working for sustainable peace with justice and equality, using as leverage the prestige that comes with the Nobel Peace Prize. She has received more than 15 honorary degrees and 20 now. Okay, yeah. Good. So she has a collection of that and has been named by Forbes magazine as one of the 100 most powerful women in the world. Has written hundreds of articles in newspapers and edited volumes. In 2013, she published her memoir, My Name is Jody Williams. It's a really, really good book. I really enjoyed reading it. It's engaging and compelling and entertaining, and it tells you how she became Jody Williams, starting from the activist, peace activist Jody Williams, starting from standing up to a bully to protect a classmate in elementary school, through her engagement in anti-Vietnam War protests and American foreign policy in Central America, and coordinating finally to the international campaign to landmines, and now leading the Nobel Women's Initiative. Okay. Our second speaker is Jared Genser. He is one of the brightest young stars in human rights advocacy and scholarship that I know of, and he's a proud alumnus of the University of Michigan Law School, having earned JD cum laude in 2001 after finishing his degrees at Cornell and Harvard Kennedy School of Government. In 2000, while still in law school, right, he founded Freedom Now, an NGO, non-governmental organization that works to free prisoners of conscience worldwide, and he has worked in at least, by my last count, 22 countries and helped secure the release of 27 individual prisoners of conscience. And his pro bono clients include an assortment of Nobel Peace Prize winners such as Desmond Tutu and Liu Xiaobo and Aung San Suu Kyi. And now he is managing director of Perseus Strategies, a law and consulting firm that focuses on human rights, humanitarian, and corporate social responsibility projects, as he continues to work on human rights and social justice issues. And he has also received various prizes, most recently from the American Bar Association International Human Rights Award in 2013. He has written countless op-ed pieces and has co-edited a couple of really important books, The Responsibility to Protect. Not a memoir, but yeah. The United Nations Security Council in the Age of Human Rights, and he's currently writing a book on the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. And perhaps most importantly for the purpose of our discussion today, he's leading the charge in authoring this report on the Resolution 1325. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming our two speakers.
I have a cell phone, but when it's home, it's off. I only carry it with me so I can tell my husband I landed safely somewhere in the world. It's really true. I hate the phone. I think it's an intrusion. Makes me mental. I'll try now to not talk about my mental issues, and because I have them, and focus on what the Nobel Women's Initiative does, because we try to put into practice, make reality of this resolution 1325, which to date I would say hasn't had essentially much of any impact on the reality of including women in issues related to peace and security. Specifically, one can count the number of peace negotiations in which women are involved. It's like 2. The numbers are ridiculous. I mean, they're so low that it's not even worth mentioning. The number of women who have actually signed peace accords is even fewer than the number who have participated in some peace negotiations. And I don't want to repeat what some of you already heard earlier at the lunch. I think it's a very complicated situation that in this century we still find women having to ask, and I'm not insulting individual men here, but I think that when women are more than 50% of the population of this planet, that we are still having to ask men for a place at the table indicates something is seriously wrong. And it's not that, I'll speak for myself, I have never wanted to be a man, period. Ever, never, not for 1 second. I have one of my own, he's awesome. He's also a human rights activist. But I've never wanted to be a man, I'm a feminist, and all that means is that I want to see equality, period. Period. And 1325 and the UN's own mandate to itself under Kofi Annan to include more women in management positions of power and authority in the UN, have essentially not resulted in much. I went on a delegation to Hiroshima. I was leading it with Shirin Ebadi, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003, first Muslim woman. She's from Iran, human rights lawyer, judge. She's been living in exile since 2009. And we were speaking to an ambassador from the UN. I do not remember how we ended up talking to him, but we did. And he happened to be talking with great pride about his participation in getting 1325 moving and turned into a real resolution. And so at the end of his comments, I asked him, well, what about the other part where you all said you'd have at least 10% of the positions of management, would be women. And I had to wonder to him, we're more than 50%. Why wouldn't we be 50%? Why 10%? But we didn't even get that far because he kind of snickered and said that he didn't think they were above 1 or 2%. And then I asked him why that was. And he said, because we can't find qualified women. Just think about that for a minute. This is an ambassador who helped get 1325 passed, prides himself on that fact, and then has the nerve to tell two women Nobel Peace Laureates with a delegation of other accomplished women that the reason there aren't women in management in the UN is because there aren't any that are qualified. Another example of issues of the UN, and I am speaking about the UN because this is a UN resolution, was relatively recently when they were attempting some sort of peace negotiations over Syria. And there was a lot of pressure on Brahimi, who was the special rapporteur or whatever he was, looking at the peace negotiations for the Secretary General. And people were pushing him to include women if there ever were peace negotiations. And publicly, he said, that's not an issue for the UN to worry about. Here's a representative of the UN that has all of these resolutions about the inclusion of women, and he says publicly, that's not our issue. And I will end with our own Secretary General at the UN. A few months ago, He was singing the praises of the UN in 1325 because it had actually passed, and we were going to be celebrating the 15th anniversary of it this year. And he was really going strong about the need for women's involvement and, blah, blah, woof, woof, blah, blah, blah. And more blah, blah, and woof, woof. Because the next week or so, he announced that for the first time in 10 years, they were creating a panel to look at peacekeeping operations, which of course involve issues related to women peacekeepers, peacekeepers raping women in countries where they're deployed to help. And of how many people? 16 members of his executive panel or whatever it is. 2 were women. 2. Right after he had sung the praises of including women. There was intense pressure put upon him. And at first he was a little belligerent in a Ban Ki-moon quiet kind of way. But he did back down, and he did make a little change. He added 2 more women. What we wanted him to do was to disband the panel that had not started any work yet and reconfigure it so it would be half women and half men. At least he did respond to public pressure on the issue. And in my evaluation, and in the evaluation of the Nobel Women's Initiative, men in power will only change when they are pushed to change. And words on a piece of paper do not force people in power to change. It's when civil society, men and women, on any issue, for the common good, not for advancing their own friends, when men and women in civil society accept their responsibilities as a citizen or a global citizen, instead of just talking about their human rights, which I am a human rights activist, but we also have responsibilities to be active participants in the world we want to see. Expecting somebody else to get the job done is not a strategy for change. Talking with our colleagues and friends over nice wine, or if you don't drink soda pop, I don't know what it is. I happen to like nice wine. About the problems of the world and doing nothing after you talk about it is complete waste of your energy. It's irrelevant. That's harsh. But it's really true. If you complain to your friends and then do nothing, all you're doing is making yourself feel good because you at least have knowledge of the problems of the world. Complaining to your friends is not a strategy for change. Change happens when people get off their butt and volunteer. I started as a volunteer a couple days a week. I was a full-time teacher. I was concerned about El Salvador. I started volunteering. Ultimately, it led to my becoming a full-time activist. But I started by volunteering just to see what it was like to get my feet wet. So when I talk about these kinds of things, or the work of the Nobel Women's Initiative, or especially to young people, I like to mention that if you're really concerned about an issue, get up and do something about it. It doesn't matter to me it doesn't have to be anything I care about. It doesn't have to be 1325. It doesn't have to be Rape and Conflict, which is a campaign that the Nobel Women started. It doesn't have to be killer robots that I work on, or any of the other things. It can be public schools in the United States, which are terrible and need to be refunded, revisited, et cetera, et cetera. It can be making your own campus green. I don't care what the issue is. But if you care about something, do something. Otherwise, zip it. In my view. And when I talk with young people around the world and they come up to me and are worried about the world, I ask them what they're doing. And most can't answer. And I say to them, that's cool. Here's my email address. When you start working on the issue you care about, send me an email. And we can start talking about, how you can do more or shift your thinking or whatever. But those in the trenches, I would say, don't have a lot of time for just whining, because it doesn't make any difference. And that's one of the reasons why the Nobel Women's Initiative was formed. In the entire history of the Nobel Prize, and the first one was in 1901, and by the way, the Peace Prize part of the Nobel Prizes only came about because of the unrequited love of Alfred Nobel, and her name was Bertha von Suttner. And she convinced him, and she's been erased from history. This is another, erasure of women and their roles from history. She convinced him that he should do a Peace Prize as well. She also thought she should be the first recipient. She really did. She did receive the Peace Prize in 1905, 100 years ago. But she got up and talked him into creating the Nobel Peace Prize. But in all of that time, there have only been 15 women, think about it, who've received the Peace Prize since 1901. And if you step back and look at the reality of war and the reality of who's trying to keep things together on the ground, it's the men who tend to wage war, people. Even though they're now including women, which I think is not a great thing, because I don't think we need to learn how to be warriors. We have enough of them already. But the men tend to wage war, and the women are trying to, keep the community going, keep their own families going. And who's gotten most of the Peace Prizes? Men. Some of whom are war criminals, in my estimate. Henry Kissinger, for example. So it trips me out. There have been 15 women. I think it's like 94 men and 34 organizations. I could be wrong, but it's something like that. For example, when I received the Peace Prize, half of it went to me and half went to the international campaign to ban landmines, because we all came together and we made that change happen. I didn't. I merely, started and got people to participate. But if you have a great idea and nobody else wants to do it, you're not going to change the world. You have to find people who want to do it with you. But when we recognized the Nobel women, that there were actually, at that point, 7 living women laureates of the, and I don't think we were 15 then. We were 12. Of the 12 at that point, there were 7 of us still alive. And we saw that as a critical mass, and we decided that we would come together and use whatever influence and access that we have because of the Peace Prize, not because we're particularly marvelous or brilliant or whatever, to help women's organizations around the world working for sustainable peace with justice and equality. And I want to point out, of all those 94 men, there's never been a Nobel Men's project or initiative of any type. To me, it's indicative of, not that women are perfect, believe me, Margaret Thatcher. I can go on, I won't. But women do have a tendency to come together and try to discuss things in a different way, try to find immediate solutions. Men would rather just kill each other, and women if we get in their way. And because of coming together, we became very involved in working with women's organizations to empower women themselves. They know what they need, to become advocates for the role of women, not just in peace conferences, but in the larger discussions of what's security. If men don't think women are capable of discussing disarmament or national security, et cetera, all those big manly issues, how are they going to take a woman seriously and put her on a peace delegation? We are struggling today in the Nobel Women's Initiative to help women empower themselves. They already know what they need in their own countries. To stand up for their rights in their own countries, to be taken seriously, to force all of the beautiful words on the resolutions and some absolutely fabulous laws in various countries. Like Colombia, 60 years of civil war, recently passed a law calling rape in war a war crime. Awesome. The level of impunity is virtually 100%. So, I invite you all, men and women, because we need men, to stand up to the plate. Women can't just be saying, come on, guys, come on, guys. If you really believe in equality, which means I don't want to be you, I just want to be recognized as an equal before the law. I want my voice heard as much as any man's voice. In discussions of national security, I have as much to say, and it's probably more coherent than many of the men I have heard discuss it, quite frankly, because I have worked for decades on it. I've worked on disarmament. We just want to be treated as equals, period. And when you elevate everybody, you elevate yourselves. I think people don't recognize that part of equality. If I see a person whose rights are being, I'm not going to swear. My mom asked me not to swear in public. It tarnishes my Nobel image. If somebody's rights are being violated and I do nothing, who am I? How am I much different from the violator? And I believe that when we recognize equality, we are recognizing our common humanity. We are refusing to accept that there is an other that is somehow less human than us, and therefore we can do anything we want to. We can violate their human rights. We can not allow them to have a voice at the table. We can treat women the way women are treated around the world. I invite all of you to go to everydaysexism.org. It's a fabulous site where women from all over the world have started writing anonymously about the day in, day out sexism that they have to put up with, which is part of the continuum of violence, both emotional, structural, physical, against women, that leads to the possibility of rape in war, which leads to the possibility, well, it's not the possibility, leads to men having the nerve to say to women who are accomplished, there aren't any, we don't know any women who are capable of being a manager in the UN. Given some of the managers in the UN I have had the misfortune of dealing with, I know a hell of a lot of women who would do a lot better job. I also know a lot of feminist men who would do a better job. I'll end there, because I could go on forever. I could give examples like I did at lunch about what we Nobel women just did in Colombia, what we just did in Turkey, what we'll be doing again where, I don't know, in The Hague. You can ask about that if you wish. But our main goal is to put into practice these words that men in the UN write on paper and then don't implement. And it's not really a slam on the body. I can slam it for a hell of a lot of reasons. But most people in power, whether it's a state legislator or a congressman or a president or a prime minister or an autocrat, if they are not pressured to implement a law that they don't really believe in, and if clearly they don't believe in 1325 or it would be implemented, they won't implement it unless there's pressure. Period. They'll just say, we have 1325, we had 1820. And then when you say, well, where are the women? There aren't any qualified. It's not the UN's business. So we have a lot of work to do. Feminist men and women. You don't have to be a feminist. You just have to believe that everybody's equal before the law. We clearly aren't all equal. My brother was born deaf. He's a paranoid schizophrenic who tried to kill me and my mother. We're not equal. Before the law, we are equal, period. Men and women should be equal before the law, period. If you get a bunch of men in a room talking to each other, the perspectives are not going to be extremely broad. Similarly, if you get a bunch of women in a room, our perspectives may not be all that broad either. But if you get a whole bunch of us, LGBTQA. It took me forever to learn it, and I'm still obviously not very good. But if you get all of those perspectives into a conversation about your society, about peace, about your future, about what the hell is national defense, you can change this world. But if you allow a handful in power to continue the power structure that has been created and guides this world, nothing will change. That's why we all have to do a little bit. And if we all do a little bit, we can do a hell of a lot. I will end with one example. There's a gentleman who sometimes represents Nobel Peace Prize winning IPPNW, which is the International Physicians to Prevent Nuclear War. It received the Peace Prize some year, I can't remember. He's a full-time medical doctor, but in his spare time, he is part of the new grassroots campaign to ban nuclear weapons, and he volunteers his time. And what he gives to the campaign is immense. And I just think about, all the ways that people can give. It doesn't have to be, down on the street screaming with a banner or something. I don't like to protest myself like that. I will occasionally. You can do it in a gajillion creative different ways, but just do it. Thank you. Don't clap. Waste of time. Really. You want mine?
Well, thank you. And Jody is a tough act to follow. It's great to be here back in Ann Arbor. I went here for law school and loved it, like most people love the University of Michigan. Surprisingly warm out, so I'm especially happy to be back. I'm going to speak in a little more detail about Resolution 1325 and kind of what it was supposed to be, what it has been, and what it could become. And I'll speak at that just to free myself up from any constraints. I'm speaking my own voice for myself and nobody else at this point. There was mention of this report that we're working on, which we are working on, and when that report is issued, it will speak for itself as well. But in this context, so I can speak freely, I'm speaking for myself. So the adoption of 1325 in the fall of 2000 was really historic, and it was historic because it recognized for the first time in the only body at the UN capable of compelling a member state to take action that there were gendered impacts of war on women, but also the role that women played in conflict prevention, resolution, and peace building. And that had never been recognized at the Security Council level before. And it spoke about three interconnected pillars of action that were supposed to flow from Resolution 1325. Meaningful participation of women at all levels in conflict and post-conflict societies and more broadly. The protection of women from gender and sexual violence and conflict. And then prevention of sexual violence and conflict and engagement with all kinds of constituencies, including civil society, to help make that happen. And there was a global consensus at that time of a desire to implement these kinds of ideas. But as Jody was describing quite eloquently, the gap between what has been promised and the reality in terms of implementation has been a gulf rather than merely just a gap. And this is a perfect time, I think, to kind of look at these issues for a couple of reasons. One, last I checked, we're in the 21st century, and to me it is really shocking the way in which the role of women globally has not yet been recognized and acknowledged around the world across various backgrounds, cultures, religions. And it's equally surprising to me how little action is actually being taken through intergovernmental institutions like the United Nations to realize that it isn't just having women in positions of power or decision-making for the sake thereof, because I don't think anybody supports, or at least I don't support that, but it's really about getting a better reality on the ground in the field where, not just conflicts are happening, but where decisions are being made that affect people's lives and empower or disempower people from living better lives. And when the UN is not capable of engaging a gender perspective in all that it is doing, it is not going to be effective at what it does on the ground. And to me, that is the reason why women's participation is so essential. So The Secretary General was commissioned to produce a report on evaluating 1325 and its 15 years of implementation. That report is being prepared by the UN organization called UN Women, and that will be published later this year. It's going to be a so-called global study on these issues. This is a historic moment in time because we're looking at the 15-year anniversary of Women, Peace, and Security, but we're also actually 20 years after the Beijing Women's Platform was adopted in 1995 in that conference in Beijing. This is also the 10-year anniversary of the responsibility to protect, the obligation of all states to prevent mass atrocities, and their gendered impacts on mass atrocity situations as well. And ultimately, what we are looking to produce is a civil society assessment of the reality of what's gone on, and to speak truth to power and to call it as we see it, and to be very frank in evaluating what has happened and what needs to happen to change the outcomes. So let me get much more specific. And again, I'm speaking for myself here, not overall. But I think that the biggest thing that one can say is that there's really been a lack of global leadership from the Secretary General or Secretaries General in the last 15 years, and from the UN Security Council itself, which has adopted well-meaning resolutions and followed them up with well-meaning statements and reports, but not with the actual allocation of serious resources invested to address the kinds of challenges of stopping rape as a weapon of war, holding perpetrators to account, engaging women in participating at all levels of decision-making and otherwise. And in fact, what happened after 1325 was adopted is that the UN machinery started to kind of churn out reports on an annual basis about this agenda. And because there weren't additional resources, in essence, what has happened is that various UN agencies that are working on these kinds of issues have reported to a central place within the UN system what they were otherwise already doing. And then that's been kind of put together and presented publicly as, here's all the great work we're doing on advancing 1325. But at the end of the day, none of those descriptive discussions of what had been being done by various UN agencies explained that, in fact, it was a direct result of 1325 rather than just merely something they were already doing. Nor did any of these reports talk about what impact did any of these programs actually have on the ground, in the field, in the real world, where these things happen. Most of the reporting that's been done over many, many years has really been focused on policy outcomes. Like, do we have a policy in place for this issue or that issue? And are we saying the right things in our reports, et cetera? In addition, the way that they've measured success on this agenda item, on 1325, on women, peace, and security, when you look at it from the outside in, is really extraordinary. And it's changed at least 4 different times over the course of the last 15 years, but the current way that success is being measured is in ways that I would think that even those of you who are undergraduates or even first-year students might realize are a major question as to the viability of the measurement system that is in place. Let me give you an example of one of these so-called indicators, right? There is an indicator that says, one of about a dozen, that says that the UN, in order to measure its success on 1325, should look at the number of UN mediation teams that have representation of a woman on it. Right? And today, congratulations, 100% of UN mediation teams in the last year have had a woman on it.
A woman.
At least a woman. No measurement as to whether or not it was a secretary or the head of the delegation. No measurement about whether it's 1 woman out of 100 or 50 women out of 60. No measurement of, therefore, what? So you had a woman on a mediation team. What were the difference in the outcomes that you actually got from all of that? So to me, you're measuring a process, not an impact in the field, in the real world, and it's a process that really has no relevance. So, I mean, for example, a simple suggestion could be, every UN mediation team should be jointly co-led by a man and a woman, right? That, I think, could actually have an impact in the way that these kinds of issues are collectively dealt with. Let's look at UN peacekeeping, and we're talking about conflict and women, peace, and security. I want to ask by a show of hands. I'm going to give you 3 options, and I'll tell you the options first. There are now currently about 30 plus UN peacekeeping missions and political missions around the world with about 110,000 personnel, peacekeepers, police, and civilian people. I'm going to ask you all, what percentage of those 110,000 people do you believe are women? And the 3 options are 15%, 5%, and 30%. So by a show of hands, how many believe that 15% are women? How many believe 5% are women? How many believe 30% was the third one? 30% are women. Okay, so if you were to look at the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations and what it says is in the last decade, there's been a 50% increase in the representation of women among peacekeepers, police, and civilians in peacekeeping missions. That's the way they present the statistic I'm about to give you. Now, one doesn't need to be a math major to realize that that's an accurate description of the reality. The United Nations from 2005 to 2015 has increased its representation of women in all of these collective operations from 1.8% to 3.6%.
Thus the 50%.
Thus the 50%.
I took a course at Johns Hopkins SAI School of Advanced International Studies, and it was entitled How to Lie with Statistics.
So, interestingly, UN peacekeeping operations is absolutely critical here. It's not just critical to stop rape as a weapon of war or to not commit rape themselves, but they're also critical.
That little detail.
But it's also critical because it's the UN peacekeeping operations that build institutions, that work with local governments and build institutions. And these UN peacekeeping operations are saying to governments, at least sometimes, that they need to be more gender responsive. But yet it's the people who are saying that to them are people who have representation of 3.6% of women. But what's amazing to me is that the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations actually has a gender-responsive peacekeeping plan for the next 5 years. That's about 15, 20 pages, and it has 10 specific goals that are articulated for what they need to do to become more gender-responsive in the 21st century. So, hooray, I'm glad that they have a plan. Better than having no plan. However, when you look at those 10 items, none of them mention anything about increasing the representation of women as peacekeepers or police or civilian operators. Now, again, for me, I don't care about, the numbers per se, although the numbers are pretty astonishing. I care about the results that we get on the ground. That's all that matters. Is rape going down or going up? Are perpetrators being held to account, or is there impunity? Are negotiations happening in conflict situations that actually meaningfully engage women at all steps of that process, that result in gender-responsive agreements, that result in changed laws and acknowledgement of the differential impacts, and really engages women in a serious way as decision makers and empowered people just as men are. To me, that's kind of what matters. Now, what's interesting is that there have been two situations where peacekeeping operations had 5 to 10% women representative rather than, I think it was 10%. And the studies that actually were shown, the academic studies showed that force acceptance, which is measured by polling and otherwise, in terms of people being happy that the peacekeepers are there, goes up dramatically when there is representation of women in the peacekeeping operations in a more substantial sense. In addition, the number of rapes reported and the number of the ability of the UN to engage on those issues also goes up dramatically. Again, this shouldn't be surprising. When you're a woman in a society and you've been raped in the midst of a conflict situation, and there are cultural dynamics and there are, fear dynamics about, if you name a perpetrator in the midst of a conflict, what could happen to you, what could happen to your family? I can imagine there are a lot of circumstances where most women would not want to talk about this in any sense at all. But the idea of going to a foreign man who is present in your country to report it and to put your faith in such a person in such an environment strikes me as wishful thinking if you believe that that actually can happen in a meaningful and systematic way. So I give these couple of examples to kind of help you understand how far we have to come to really change the dynamics in these kinds of situations. We have measurements going on that don't relate to the actual claimed results we say we want to achieve. We have major departments of the United Nations like DPKO, which...
What is DPKO?
Sorry, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations.
Thank you.
The Peacekeeping Operations Department that has 3.6% and describes it as a 50% increase over the last 10 years. And And though they are the most critical body, I mean, there are lots of other UN agencies that come in and help in these situations, but more than any other, they are the ones on the ground trying to make this stuff happen. And in essence, they, by definition, are doing a do as we say, not as we do, when engaging with governments about taking the role of women seriously as participants, decision makers, and looking at the impacts. I would also say that there has been not nearly remotely enough emphasis on the role of civil society in these conflict situations and the benefits that they bring to the table. And UN agencies, where monies have been made available, at most partnerships are with major international NGOs. But the reality is, as Jody said, and what we both experience as we travel all over the place, is that there are people on the ground having a huge impact, and they may not be people who know accounting or that can, track exactly every outcome that one could imagine, and they might not meet international standards personally, but guess what? One woman or man or a couple people come together and they're helping a whole community deal with the, providing services to women who have been raped or whatever the issue might be. And they're doing an amazing job. And the UN system and the international community has failed to provide the support to these kinds of groups and individuals who are the heroes, the people who inspire me every day when I think about why I do what I do. And when I get frustrated, I think about people like that. And so there needs to be a more systematic way to provide the financial support for people like that, to be able to do what they do and do it better and with greater support. And then over time, with additional training and support and capacity building, enable them to learn how to have a budget and to track outcomes. And over time, get bigger and bigger grants to have an impact on the ground. And unfortunately, oftentimes we appear as the international community to be transformational tourists, where we, show up on their doorstep under the authority of a UN resolution and we say, we're here to solve your problems. And the reality is, the UN's here today, gone tomorrow. None of these missions have remotely enough resources to be able to sustainably keep this over time where it needs to be. And, and at the end of the day, you really need to see a very, very different way forward. So let me lastly mention a couple of things very briefly to conclude. First, it comes down to leadership, as I said, from the Secretary General, from the Security Council, from presidents and prime ministers around the world, to not only say this is a priority, but to allocate major resources. $1 billion, to me personally, would be a fine start, but not even remotely sufficient. And to be clear, resources alone are not a solution to any problem. It's resources well deployed that will have an impact, not just resources. But there have been no resources really allocated to implementing 1325. There's been a grand total of $20 million of new money over the last 15 years, which is nothing. Second, there needs to be a new way that the UN itself deals with engaging on this whole set of issues, where the Security Council is more engaged on a day-to-day basis, where the Secretariat, which coordinates all the UN agencies, where the Secretary General sits, is actually playing a proactive leadership role rather than a facilitative, passive collection of information role and kind of regurgitating and collating of information, but taking leadership, saying, here's our goal this year. Our goal is to stop rape and conflict. Here are the 10 things we need to do that. Here's where the money gets allocated. Here's how we implement it. And then lastly, we need new strategies to be able to actually achieve the outcomes in the field that we want to achieve. To me, it's amazing that 15 years after the adoption of 1325, there are claims by lots of people about impacts of this resolution. Well, there was never a baseline study done about where were we back then. So if you don't know where you were then how do you know where you need to go? And so I would just conclude by agreeing with Jody completely that, even when
That's smart.
Thank you. When we talk about having an impact on the world, a lot of these issues or a lot of what we're talking about is incredibly difficult to think about trying to change. And we don't have to, in our day-to-day lives, look at changing all of these things. It's about finding friends, finding partners, finding people that can inspire us and that can help us, and then choosing in our own lives and our own spheres of influence something that you can do to make a difference in the world. And, over time, I started here way back when, not that long ago, actually, aspiring to be an international human rights lawyer. Today, I'm a human rights lawyer, and I've learned a heck of a lot along the way about how to get from here to there and to have a bigger impact over time. And if you just get in and you start volunteering in your community, you're going to start by making an impact on 1 or 2 or 10 or 100 people's lives. And over time, if that's your aspiration, then you'll be able to have a much, much bigger impact because people will see that you're just taking off the gloves and getting in the community, getting your hands dirty, and just making an impact. So I would encourage all of you to do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, boss. Questioning at this
Let's
point.
do question and
Yeah,
answer.
okay. So we'll open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand.
You can ask anything. We won't act like it's ill-informed or uninformed. Will you just stand up so everybody can hear you and say your name because we don't know you?
Hi, I'm Joya. Nice to meet y'all. I just had a question. So it's very clear that maybe not all of us feel that way in this room, but I kind of consider you a sort of radical in the sense of you operate within a certain institution, but you're met with a lot of resistance. So I feel that way here at U of M. So I'm just kind of wondering, how do you deal with that resistance, or how do you kind of deal with actors who are visibly and physically in your way of accomplishing your goals, on a personal level and a social level as well?
I ignore them and move around them. I'm not joking. At the age of 13, I had a couple of pivotal thoughts. One that was that God might not exist. I was raised Catholic and wanted to be the first woman pope, not realizing that I couldn't even be an altar boy. I realized that I never wanted children. I would be a horrific mother. And I never had them and never wanted them. It's okay not to want children. And the third thing, which is probably the most important, was I started to understand that, I couldn't say it this way then, that I really didn't care what other people thought about me. And I don't mean that I could run around naked in the street, drunk and, doing stupid things. I mean, I could do that, and that would obviously generate an opinion. But in terms of my beliefs in the world, I became very clear very quickly that the only person ultimately who matters about what I do is me. At the end of the day, I look in the mirror and see myself. And believe me, there are plenty of days I look in the mirror and wish I could just go to sleep and ignore it all and quit being myself. Some days I don't want to be me anymore. At the same time, I know that I'm working for the greater good. Even people I do not like. And believe me, there are many I do not like, even in the NGO world. I think that's the critical thing. Deciding who you are, what you want out of life, what impact that you want to make for the positive in the world, and finding a way to move toward that. Because if you worry about what every single person or person of influence thinks about what you think, you'll either not talk at all, or when I'm with you, I'll talk one way because you're a radical. And when I'm with you, I might not talk at all because you intimidate me. And when I'm with you guys over there, I'll try to sound like I might be a right-winger. It wouldn't work, as you can tell, but, if you have clarity, you unite with people who have similar clarity and you move forward. Yes, I am not the most popular woman in the United States to the powers that be. Do I care? N-O. N-O. My job is not to make them like me. If I wanted them to like me, I would run for political office. I'm completely serious. I wouldn't run for political office. I know who I am and I know what I want to do in the world, period. You don't have to like me. I ain't inviting you to my house for dinner anyway. But I know who I am and I know why I'm doing it, and I can go to sleep at night and feel decent about it, even if I don't always do it in the bestest of ways.
So I would say I'm less radical, but very much focused on results as a human rights lawyer, right? But one doesn't need to be a lawyer to have the orientation that I have at all, to say the
Thank
least.
God.
Thank God. So
Kill the lawyers first. Where did that come from? French Revolution. Kill the lawyers
I think they were
first.
saying that many years before that.
Yeah, I know, but it came out of there the most famously.
So what I would just say very briefly is that when I'm representing a client who's been a victim of human rights abuses, it's about getting to the results that they need and what's going to be most effective at getting me there. And you think of a human rights lawyer and you think of somebody who's pounding on the table, and I maybe did a little pounding on the table there, or grandstanding or whatever you might want to call it. But at the end of the day, it's about what's going to get the job done most effectively. And some of the cases that I'm most proud of are cases where I got a person out of prison who you've never heard of and you never will hear of, because if I had gone public on the case, it would have gotten them killed or worse. And there was a route to success to get them out of prison that would result in no pats on the back from me publicly and nothing other than a hug from the person who got out of prison and their family. And that was good enough for me because I had clarity of purpose around what I was trying to achieve, which was helping this victim get out of prison. And so this is how I approach everything I do in life. And actually, I think the most important trait for a human rights lawyer or a human rights activist to have is actually flexibility. To be smart enough to know when you're going to get something done or not. Now, look, there's times you pick fights intentionally because you're trying to make a public point, and if that helps achieve the goal, then that's the right thing to do at that moment in time. But there are other times when you can get a lot done by having to engage in tough private discussions with people. And so I guess I would just say, to me, all I care about is the results, and by having the clarity of purpose of representing and working with victims and what they want to achieve, like they're very clear on what they want, and it's my job to get them there as rapidly as possible. And I'm going to choose the tactics that are going to get me there as quickly as possible, regardless of my own ego or otherwise.
The best coalitions in the world are those that have people like him and people like me and people in between. I'm completely serious.
Are we at two ends of the spectrum?
No. I'm just making a point. Watch out. Watch out.
I've been lucky to work with a
Kill
lot of
the
people
lawyers
who are,
first.
Kill the lawyers first, exactly. It's a good start.
Well, it could be sometimes.
Non-violently, of course.
Yes.
My question stems from
What's your name?
Lydia. My question stems from what the actual definition of a woman is, either formally or de facto, when speaking in terms of the UN. And my questioning stems from the reasoning behind that women are often seen as like a monolith, and there's no actual engaging with the fact that we do come, from different classes, different colors, and with different experiences, as well as like sexuality and the way we just interact with our gender. So that's my question.
I'll just say my answer. I don't care whether a woman is brown, black, white, yellow, whatever. I don't care if she's transgender, cross-dresser, I don't care. If you are a woman, an anatomical woman or whatever, you have every single right that a guy has. That's all I look at. I mean, you can certainly divide the issue into black women, and, there are certainly specific issues to different cultures, but in the work we do at Nobel Women's Initiative, it's to try to ensure that women are equal, period. Period. You can define who you are, I don't care. I don't know that there is a defined woman. If you tried to get the UN to do that, they would be doing it for the next millennium. I'm not joking. Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah. No, I mean,
they'd have a passel of lawyers trying to do, it's true, trying to do the definition of woman. You might have a...
No, I mean, I would agree. I think clearly when it comes to human rights, it's a lowest common denominator approach within the UN system. And obviously there are governments that come from religious and cultural perspectives that don't view the role of women in the world in the same way that Jody and I might.
Yet they've signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Right. Well, it's interesting. 92% of the world's people are living in countries that are covered by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which includes a right, by the way, to non-discrimination on the basis of gender. And yet, of course, the gap between those legal commitments and the reality is huge in all over the world. But yeah, I mean, I think it's very, very hard to get the UN. One of the fights that has to happen at the UN is around the definitions and around particularly
LGBTQA.
Sorry. So all of those issues are just not well handled within the UN system because of the lowest common denominator approach, and that's one of the fights that many NGOs that I have worked with are engaged in fighting as part of the broader set of issues which need to be engaged in more broadly.
Yeah, that everybody should have equal human rights.
Yeah, I'm Susan Waltz, and thank you both for coming. The question that I've been wondering about is 1325, and what happened in the first maybe 3 to 5 years after it was passed. And Jody, I'm particularly thinking about your work with the landmines and all of the work that went into not just crafting a treaty, but some implementation and some of the disappointments that happened when there were workarounds that folks on the other side found to that. But the resolution on including women in peace negotiations happened after, as I'm remembering, the last women's conference. There was the whole series of women's conferences: Nairobi, Mexico City, Copenhagen, and then the culmination in Beijing. But there hasn't been one, has there, since that time? And so I'm getting to the question. The heart of the question is, was there a coalition of women's organizations around the world that pressed for implementation after this resolution was passed, or did it just fall into the abyss, and it wasn't until the Nobel Women's Group, the women picked it up, that it really started to get some closer kind of scrutiny for implementation?
I'll give the example of the landmine treaty, and then comment if I can. I'm sure he'll have things to say. The reason the landmine treaty was successful is because the campaign did not disband after it was achieved. Our goal was a treaty banning anti-personnel landmines, increased resources for victims, and increased resources for demining. I am fully convinced that the countries that were in Oslo in 1997 in September, concluding the negotiations of that treaty, fully expected that the international campaign to ban landmines would be so thrilled that we would declare victory and go home. Instead, we spent part of the 3 weeks of negotiations in sessions outlining what we as the campaign, what we as a global grassroots movement were going to do to ensure that the governments obeyed all of the elements of the law they had just created. So everybody's clapping at the end of, the negotiations, which was totally awesome. And as that's happening, we were walking around giving them our action plan to every single delegation in the room to show them that we were not going away, that we took this seriously. We did not see the treaty itself, words on paper, as the end of it all, but the hardest part. Writing, it's easy. The hardest part is implementation. And that campaign, I'm not that involved in it anymore, but it still exists. It still pushes governments. There are 162 nations in the world today that are part of it. Dozens of countries have been declared mine-free because of demining. I think it's $4 billion has been spent on mine clearance and victim assistance, none of which would have happened without the ICBL. And it's because there is a grassroots coalition that strategizes together, has a general action plan, and some can do it, some don't. You aren't compelled. But we think forward and we take steps to make it happen. And I would say, no, there hasn't been. When the Nobel Women's Initiative started talking with some other colleagues, and it's a little interesting, the 3 women who really were pushing for the creation of the campaign to stop rape and gender violence and conflict, all of us were products of the international campaign to ban landmines. Some of the more established women's organizations saw it as a threat. Seriously. I mean, there are turf wars in the NGO world. The nuclear ban movement, since the bomb was created, has been populated by men who have become old and complacent and devised their strategy based on what the states are saying when they get together in the UN. That's not how you get a ban. You get a ban calling for a ban and pushing for a ban. But women's organizations, took umbrage and thought because we wanted, NGOs to work together in a common strategy doesn't mean you give up your individual work. It just means you think together. That we were trying to imply that nothing had been done before. So sometimes it's challenging, but we do have now 700 NGOs that are part of it. But I believe that civil society has to be coherent in its pressure to make international agreements reality. Governments are, full of other things they're doing. They're not going to pay attention if they aren't forced to, which is an unfortunate reality.
I mean, my own view, I'll just add one additional brief comment, is from an outside-in perspective, because it's only been in the last couple of years that I've started to work on this, and only in the last year that I've worked on it intensively, there's been not such a coalition that has been in place for 1325. There are a couple of well-established and placed people that pushed for it in the Security Council and helped make it happen, and it definitely built off of Beijing and the prior conferences and otherwise, and the Beijing outcome document has a section on the differential impact of conflict on women and the need for participation in these issues. But there has not been, there is an NGO working group on women, peace, and security that is based in New York that has, a couple dozen members in it. But it, unfortunately, has been primarily a
UN lobbying body.
Well, a UN lobbying body that's consisted of organizations that are all run by women, and not the major human rights groups in the world that need to, should have, and must take this up as a central priority and advocate for it. And I'm talking about an Amnesty, a Human Rights Watch, others. They've done smaller programs on it, but it hasn't been a focus of their work. And until everybody agrees and understands that women's rights are human rights and that we all need to be lobbying together on this stuff, and we need a global campaign of the kind that Jody did with ICBL. Until we have that kind of a coalition built to focus on implementation, we're not going to get the progress that we need. We're not going to get the resources we need, and we're not going to get the outcomes or the impact in the field that we want. And so, sadly, in the last 15 years, there have been lots of UN reports churned out and lots of trainings and lots of other kinds of things. And my own personal assessment is just that it hasn't been remotely sufficient for the importance of the issue, and the results show. So I think that part of what with the collective review, looking back the last 15 years, has to be a self-reflection on the part of civil society about where civil society has come up short. It's not just the UN and governments around the world, but civil society has also come up short in many respects. And I think we all need to learn from, what's happened in the last 15 years to the next 15 are quite different.
Hi, I'm Bree. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you for coming.
As we've heard over the past hour, obviously there's a lot of issues in women's representation in these governing bodies, and their protection under the law. But where do you think this kind of stems from? So is it just kind of a lack of concern for women's issues? Is it just people not willing to, certain people not willing to take the initiative to change these issues? Or is it that there's the belief that some people believe that women shouldn't be represented equally or shouldn't be protected equally under the law?
It's still a male-dominated world. The socioeconomic structures of the world are male-dominated. And those in power very rarely give up power. So if, a certain sector of the global society has been deciding who has rights and who doesn't, you do not have real democracy, you do not have real freedoms, and you are going to continue to have a system in which, one sector of society rules everything and occasionally grants minorities and women and, token things like the one woman or two on a peace delegation or whatever to try to pretend that they get it, That's why I, believe that there has to be not just more consistent pressure, but men really need to step up to the plate. Men who don't want to be seen as, I think I'm trying to control myself, as oppressors of anybody, need to stand up and say, we need equality. Doesn't mean you're a wimp. It just means that you have recognized that equality before the law helps everybody. Period. It's nothing that, doesn't take that much intellect. But I believe the fundamental is that those in power will not give up power easily. And we see it. UN couldn't even meet its own measly goal of 10%. Why? It's all, not all, mostly men who will tell you that the reason they can't include women is because we aren't qualified. What does that say? What does that say? They're in power. They don't want to give it up. Understandable. I'm not saying that it's necessarily of evil intent. It's just the way the system has always been. You know, even when an individual wants to change something about themselves, think about how hard it is. You know, if you set a goal for yourself, it's really tough. Imagine you're trying to shift the entire framework of how societies see themselves, see women, men, minorities, all of that, and that's a hell of a job. And it does take concerted effort and sometimes some coordination. Doesn't mean everybody has to walk like robots to the same, beat, but some recognition. I'll stop there because I could go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at where we are in the United States on these issues, where we still have an incredibly long way to go. I mean, we've made obviously a lot of progress, but we have a very, very long way to go. You look at the role of women in the U.S. military, you look at the representation in the U.S. Congress and the Senate, you look at corporations and the percentage of top global Fortune 500 CEOs that are women, which is maybe what, 2, 3? I mean, it's something like that. So, I mean, again, it's not women for the sake of women being present, but it's about being responsive to the needs of half of society. And yet, in the United States, we still have a long way to go. So if you can think about our country, which is a democracy in which, we espouse these principles where there are lots of people, from civil society lobbying for decades and last, 100 years, 115 years in these issues, and then you go to other societies that come from very different cultural backgrounds and have very different cultural norms, different religious views and otherwise, and then you take a lowest common denominator approach across all of them, you end up with some serious challenges. And so I think that pretty much explains it. I will say that there's hope, and hope comes from the stories that I've heard from people like a guy who I've known for many years who spent 15 years at the UN as the top legal advisor to the UN and had an office of about 150, 200 people. And when he joined it, it was after Kofi Annan talked about increasing the percentages of women. And I'm sorry, it was like right at the beginning of his first term. And when he came in this position, this guy, Hans Corell, said that there were roughly 10 to 15% of the staff in his office were women. And his view was, we deal with every issue all over the world on behalf of the UN, and every UN agency, and everything is all relating to men and women. And I need people of all backgrounds, not just men and women, but across different countries, across regions, across cultural sensitivities, religions. That's what I need as a lawyer to work the system well. And when he left, he set a goal for himself that within 10 years he wanted there to be a 50-50 split between men and women roughly in his office. And he achieved that goal. And he achieved that goal by saying to people, I'm not going to just kick men out, right? Men are going to leave, and guess what? When you have 90-10%, most of the people who leave, 9 out of 10 are going to be men. Let's look to get equally qualified men and women. If it's a tie, then, give it to the woman, right? Or if the woman's more qualified, obviously it goes to the woman. But, at the end of the day, he was able to achieve that within the UN system in an office of 150, 200 people. My view is, again, it comes down to leadership, right? And it's not just lip service. It has to be followed by concerted action. And he had a lot of things to do and a lot of issues to cover, but by keeping one eye on it, and by giving clear direction to his HR department about what he wanted and how he wanted to prioritize it, he was able to achieve the outcome. And my view is, if there's the will, if there's the political will, then there's the way, and we need to advocate strongly to create the political will. Absolutely. Because right now there's not the political will to focus on this in the way, in my view, it needs to be focused on.
I just want to give another statistic. I have a couple friends who actually are in the corporate world. Not usually, it's not that I don't like them, but our worlds don't interact generally. But one woman who is very powerful in the financial sector, and she cited to me many times different studies done in the corporate world, probably by the women in the corporate world, that clearly indicate that until there are at least a corporation board, until at least 30% of it is women, the views of the women will still not be reflected. That if it's less than that, the men still dominate the discussion, still push toward the outcome that if it were all men, that there needs to be enough of women or a minority or, divergent views for people to feel confident in expressing them. If you're the only woman in the room and you express a view, they're gonna, go, that's really nice. Let's put it on the agenda for the next meeting. You need enough bodies so that people who are in a minority will speak up.
And I would just say quickly, one sentence. I believe at the time, this will be one sentence, at the time of the
How
option.
How long is it going to be?
A very
is it
long
gonna
one,
be
a
a
run-on. It's definitely going to be a run-on with a few semicolons. When 1325 was adopted, I believe at the time it was actually 15 male ambassadors of the Security Council that adopted it. Today there are 6 female ambassadors in the UN Security Council. Progress, some progress.
Mm-hmm.
But again,
I think the Security Council sucks, so I wouldn't necessarily call it progress. It's a vestige of World War II.
Hi, my name is Christina Griffiths. I just have a quick question about the He for She campaign. So the UN started the He for She campaign, and I saw the speech that Emma Watson made in the beginning, and I thought it was really good. But then the follow-up speech came out, I think it was like last week or so, and they mentioned how there aren't enough steps for people to then follow along with what He for She means. And I was just wondering what your general impressions are for the campaign.
Well, I haven't delved into the campaign, to be honest, because I'm unfortunately, given my experiences with the UN, I'm extremely skeptical. The UN also started a campaign to stop rape. And all it ended up being were, famous people and not famous people saying, stop rape. That's like, pushing a button on your computer to, petition for something. Clicking activism is not activism.
slacktivism.
Slacktivism. It can be a useful tool of activism, but that alone is not activism. And I guess the he for she is the same kind of thing. You get a bunch of people saying, I'm a he and I'm for she. So what? Now what do you, as you say, what are you going to do with the he for she? How are you going to promote it, What are your action plan? What steps will you as an individual take? When we were getting toward the point of launching our Stop Rape campaign, we asked every woman at the conference that was put together to shape the outline of what it might look like, once we all kind of agreed, to state at the end their personal commitment to, I'm sorry, I'm so tired. What were they going to do individually and collectively in their organizations to advance the campaign to stop rape and gender violence and conflict? And if you go to the Stop Rape and Gender Violence and Conflict website, there are, things you can do. Explaining a problem and not helping people understand what they can do is pretty much about as bad as whining about a problem and doing nothing.
Hi.
Last question.
Okay, I'm Emily Richner, and I was just wondering, do you think that women need to adapt their personality traits to advance to these positions of power?
I mean, like Lean In?
What?
You know the book Lean In?
And,
I lean out.
Okay. Yeah, and just what traits do you think that women have to, do you think they're kind of forced to adapt to certain qualities to earn positions of power, I guess?
Go to everydaysexism.org. No, I'm serious. That will give some basis for understanding what happens to individual women when they try to do things differently, which is why you need at least 30%. But I don't think women should do that. To do that is ceding our individual power by accepting that the best way or the only way or the most important way to be is to be like a man. And men are great, but I don't want to be like them. I bring different stuff to the table because I'm not them. So I would never do that, ever, never. I know other people do make choices, but usually it ends up getting them hurt in one way or another. The daughter of a very close friend of mine is the assistant to an ambassador at the United Nations. She was desperate to get into the UN. He hits on her about once a week. And, we've had collective discussions about, and she says that she's talked to him about it and, you can't do that. And his response is, well, I'm from a part of the world where, we just can't not appreciate a beautiful woman. She should tell him to F off and quit and get a different job instead of hoping that by suffering, day in and day out harassment from this fool, she will get a meaningful job in the UN. How much of your soul do you give up? If you give up too much of it, by the time you have an important position, you don't have a soul because you have done so many things to get there that who are you anymore? That's my personal feeling.
I think everyone makes their own choices as to what they want to do. Sometimes people can't make their own choices and they feel compelled, and they are compelled to act in particular ways. As a guy, I have the luxury of not having to spend much time worrying about how the gendered impacts of what I speak and communicate. I'm a little more sensitive, I think, than the average guy, so I actually think about in contexts that I'm involved in, I can unfortunately sometimes cut people off, and that has different gendered impacts. And so I do try to be sensitive to those things, but the reality is I wouldn't want to be engaging with women who are modulating their behavior to fit in with me. I'd rather just have them be themselves and engage in a conversation and not have to sit around worrying about gendered impacts of how you're engaging. I want to hear strong views, and I want them expressed, and that's what I encourage of the people I work with. And, I just want to give credit where the best views come out and get the best outcomes. And I don't care who it's coming from. I just want the best ideas. My hope is as our society advances, there'll be many more people who will view things that way. I think in a lot of contexts, many people do want to see that. But you're right that very tough choices. Women in various parts of the world don't have any freedom whatsoever to be able to dissent even to their own husband, let alone otherwise. So it's very much a work in progress.
Great. I know there are more questions and there's certainly more discussions to be had. And for that, I invite all of you to a reception that we're holding outside, and they will be available to speak to you. So feel free to go up to them and ask questions. And I know Jody doesn't like to be applauded, but
no, God, please, really don't.
I like to be applauded.
You can applaud him. Don't applaud me.
I think you all deserve an applause. Okay?
When I win a Nobel Peace Prize, I would have to be applauded.